I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies. This morning, we're talking with Damien G. who's a writer and storyteller. He's written for The Guardian, BBC, Wired. I first came to know him, however, from his very lively YouTube channel and his public criticism of different kinds of science fiction work and different kinds of attitudes and philosophical views in science fiction, which we want to talk about today. He also teaches an online course with tens of thousands of students worldwide. So welcome, Damien.
Hello.
Your motto for your program is the new mythos. Tell us, why do you consider science fiction the new mythos? Is it distinctive as the new mythos? What is it telling us about our future and our condition?
Well, I think we find ourselves in need of a mythos. This is a term that I use probably quite ignorantly from its origins in kind of ancient Greek
scholar.
Culture. Well, one of the things that I find thinking about science fiction is that there's ever increasing range of people I would like to know about, and I go and find out little things about them. Campbell I know quite a lot about, but from quite a long time ago now. So I use this term mythos in kind of an increasingly personalized, or I guess professional way, to try and think about this space where stories move out of the realm entirely of fiction and start to have really kind of potent significance for a big group of people, a community, a society, a whole civilization. And because we're a global civilization now, we have very complex myths kind of powering our civilization, many of which we're largely unconscious of. I think people who think about this kind of thing can kind of become conscious of some of them. And I think one of the most interesting areas of myth making that we have is science fiction, because it fuses together two otherwise quite disparate parts of what we're doing in as humans, as 8 billion of us on this planet at the moment, one of which is our kind of very powerful scientific and technological innovation, which we're all very aware of. You know, it's the driver of our economy. We think a lot about our technology. But the other half of science fiction, of course, is the fiction, the story, or the mythos. And we're generally much less aware as a civilization of what our stories are, what their significance are. And so science fiction gets to play in this space where it talks about many of the things that are happening in the world around us today. And I don't mean that in a kind of a purely literal way. I think if you write the kind of pop culture magazine article about science fiction and say, aha, it inspired flip-up mobile phones or something like that. And I think that's kind of the table stakes for what science fiction is doing. It's actually operating on a much deeper level than that at the moment, and providing, I think, probably many of the myths that we're using today.
And Damien, to follow up on that, could I just ask you, so would an example be Hal in Space in 2001 Space Odyssey sort of saying, I'm sorry, I can't do that, as a kind of founding myth of the AI that takes control? Would that be a kind of example of which then, you know, whether it has a basis or not in the actual science of AI, sort of reverberates through popular anxieties, etc.?
Sure, yeah, and we do have a science of AI there, and these things we're calling AI at the moment are related to that. They have emerged out of there, so they have that claim. But their primary claim to being AI, I think, is from our stories and from our science fiction. I mean, I don't want to be rude about the industry currently behind AI, but I think they've taken this idea that has come out of science fiction, that we're going to have some kind of consciousness emerging from technology. And they've really used it as a marketing boost, an enormous marketing boost. I think if you were going to take LLMs, you would say that they're something like I like Ted Chiang's description, that they're a blurry JPEG of the internet. And from that blurry JPEG, you can derive lots of kind of interesting patterns, but they're not really AI as we thought about it. But by adding that brand to it, we've created an enormous marketing sensation, a huge stock market bubble as well, which I think is probably going to crash and burst, or might be in the process of doing that at the moment. But I think it's an interesting example of how something crosses over from myth and has very, very profound effects around us. And the tech industry has done this a lot. And of course, it draws on stories like HAL. HAL is quite late in the evolution of our representation of AI, really. We've already had lots of stories up to that point about the idea that our machines are going to turn on us. We're going to be trapped within them. This goes back to kind of the late 19th century, really. You've got stuff like The Machine Stops. I forget the name of the writer, but this is like Forster. A constant theme. Forster, of course, yeah. That's going through our culture. But I think actually Kubrick does something much more interesting in 2001, because he draws the line from the AI to the human. It's not just Hal who is murderous. It's every stage of technology that has come up to Hal. That's Kubrick's argument there. And Hal is just the pinnacle of that. So he's drawing the line from AI to the kind of mind that makes AI, that part of the human mind that generates technology and technological development.
Your point about the relationship between science fiction and the current AI industry is interesting, because a lot of critics until last year would have said, hey, you're just saying that this is going to kill everybody so you can sell more of your product. You know, you're trying to convince us that your product's so great, so powerful, that if we don't buy now, it's going to kill everybody. And I agree that there was that. But is your pessimism that there actually will be AI, and that we've been sold the myth of a conscious AI that you don't think is coming, or just that it's not here yet and people keep expecting it mythologically?
Well, I think if we were really going to look at what is emerging with AI, we'd have to date it back. How far could we date it back? Let's date it back to the beginning of capitalism. This is an essay that I'm working on at the moment. The very controversial philosopher Nick Land, who is the origin of accelerationism. And at the core of Nick's argument is the idea that AI and capitalism are the same thing, which he places in that way as a bit of to kind of incite a response from people. You could also say that they're aspects of the same thing. They're aspects of a kind of emerging intelligence. We're turning Earth into something like a cybernetic intelligence, a giant, rocky, gaseous brain, you might say. And what we've done with LLMs is just add another little part to that. So in one sense, the hype is real. In the other sense, I think the real issue is that what the AI industry is the trick they're trying to play is to say that this is just owned on a server somewhere, which then belongs to a corporation, which can produce profits for shareholders. Whereas I think any genuine assessment of AI would have to say that it is emerging, at least across our entire civilization. And that takes you to ideas of like emerging technosphere and that kind of thing.
Are you saying that many of our anxieties about artificial intelligence are displaced anxieties about capitalism? I think Ted Chiang's made that point before as well. Or is it that the two are actually the same thing? It's just
I think that's the position that I'm exploring at the moment. That they are indeed the same thing. So our anxieties about them are very, very well placed, I think, because we don't really know what this thing is. So we can talk about it as super intelligence and the kind of Nick Nick Bostrom take. Maybe it will destroy us all, but maybe it will be something much, much weirder than that as well. Or maybe it'll be really cool. One of my favorite science fiction writers is Ian M. Banks. He has minds. His entire utopia, which I call the only science fiction utopia that works, is built on the minds, the artificial intelligences, which are godlike and completely benign. They just look after humans. They make a perfect world for us. Maybe that's what's emerging, but we really don't know. Is anything emerging? Is this just some kind of misplaced superstition? We do that a lot. We take a lot of our old Christian mythos and we recast it as science fiction. So is AI a god or a demon? But I think the least we can say about it is that we don't necessarily know, and that LLMs as a specific technology are much less than AI, but perhaps part of something larger.
Could I ask you more, Damien, about this idea of science fiction providing mythos? I'm trying to see if I'm getting this correctly. So, like, one version of the mythos could be sort of science fiction offering a rough draft, as it were, of the future, or a kind of sketch of a possible future. Something like, I guess Gattaca or Minority Report, or, like that these are the kinds of forms of life we would have under these kinds of technologies. So I guess one question I have is that part of what you mean by mythos? And then I guess, since I know you're also a critic of some science fiction, I wonder, like, would you be more critical of a mythos like that that's more easily kind of exploited by the tech industry, right? So the sort of Terminator type rough draft, exploited by the doomers to say, A, like Jay was saying, what we do really matters, and B, you really have to be careful. So I guess the two questions there are science fiction as a rough draft of the future, and which kinds of mythos are you more critical than others?
Well, I mean, the thing that science fiction isn't is a prediction of the future, because you could probably find any other group of people who would have a better track record of predicting the future than science fiction writers. There's a very good interview with Isaac Asimov and Harlan Ellison. And Harlan Ellison makes the point that with the number of science fiction writers out there, every now and again, we should more regularly than we do actually predict something about the future. So science fiction is doing something else. And the evidence that it must be doing something is just its enormous popularity. And I think science fiction has actually become so popular now that for most people, it no longer exists as science fiction. So there is a YouTuber called Melody Sheep, and he never uses the word science fiction with what he does. He made a video, I think it's been seen something like 24 million times now, about what the future might bring. Will it be optimistic or will it be destructive? For the vast majority of people who see that, they aren't associating the word science fiction with it. This is just the logical potential of the future. If you hold certain assumptions about the nature of reality, a kind of materialist model of reality that science gives to most people today, the idea that we're going to do things like upload consciousness to the cloud and then maybe into robot bodies, maybe that we're going to have transhuman options, about remodeling our genetic code. For an increasing number of people, these aren't originated from science fiction. These are just what reality is. Because the process that science fiction went through of extrapolating these ideas from science is now very, very, very widespread across our culture. You can look at a children's cartoon. It's not a cartoon, an animation on YouTube, Skibbity Toilet. And there's now so much Skibbity Toilet. It's got billions of views across the videos. There's other animators making Skibbity Toilet now. Probably no one will ever be able to see all of Skibbity Toilet. And of course, for me, it's science fiction. I can see where all these bits come from. But for the 8-year-old watching it, it's just some kind of weird depiction, not even necessarily of the future, but some corner of reality there. So for me, that's what our mythos is. It's this evolving field of story which reflects kind of our assumptions about reality and answers eternal questions about reality for us that we can't answer in any other way. What's going to happen after death? That's a big question in science fiction. And now we have these ideas like uploading consciousness. Perhaps we'll be infinitely reincarnated. With all the horrors that could imply. There is some really good short story writing about the horrors of being a consciousness reincarnated billions of times.
I have no mouth and I must scream.
Culture. Well, yeah, that's of course a very cool one. Other questions, what is out in space? Or, even before you get to that point, what is the nature of space? So you have scientists, early, but kind of proto-scientists, Giordano Bruno, reflecting on the potential infinity of the universe and thinking, well, there must be other worlds with other life similar to us upon them. And fast forward a few centuries and you get Star Trek from that. So we're trying to answer these very deep, profound questions, and we can only do it in story. We can't factually answer these questions for ourselves. So these stories are very, very powerful in our culture, and they always have been for all of human civilization.
I'm a sociologist, and one of the studies that caught my attention back in the 80s was an analysis of the speculative fiction fandom, and they found science fiction fans were very distinct from fantasy fans and horror fans, although there was some overlap. Recently, people have been pointing out that Anduril, Palantir are companies founded by these tech bros, and that they come out of the Tolkien mythos, and that also like Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, she's a big Tolkien fan, always has been, and that there's a kind of far right Tolkien connection out there. Some I wouldn't say it's definitive, but do you think that there's a different political or a different kind of engagement with Enlightenment ideas on the science fiction side of things, especially the Star Trekian kind of science fiction, versus the fantasy side where races have characters and there's real good and evil at play?
Yeah, the fantasy and science fiction question. Well, I think all science fiction is fantasy. In the psychoanalytic Freudian sense, it's satisfying a desire or a drive that we can't necessarily satisfy in life. So in a fantasy story, that might be a 12-year-old boy dreaming of flying on a flying carpet, or you can fulfill those same fantasies with a space rocket, for instance. And that's kind of the foundation of what science fiction as popular art has always catered to, and what our myths have always catered to as well. Our mythos is always profoundly bound up with our fantasies. And for children, these are things like simple power trip fantasies. But as we become more mature and more sophisticated, our fantasies evolve as well. And science fiction is very good at catering to these more sophisticated fantasies for an audience of people who don't necessarily think that they are indulging their fantasies at the time, people who are very much Enlightenment in their values. And I'd say this is about 70% of the science fiction audience are, they might be very interested in the division that's called hard science fiction. So it is really just extrapolating scientific principle. It doesn't deal with things like faster than light drives. It's more about exploring the solar system or how we might get on generation ships to other planets, for instance. But still, I would argue that there is this very powerful core of the satisfaction of fantasy in that kind of science fiction there, which makes it very powerful for powerful people. We've always had this potential for myths in society. In fact, really the only time we have records of myths is when they're picked up by some power in your civilization and they start actually recording them. So you've had these stories kind of churning over oral storytelling traditions, maybe for hundreds of years. about a man who comes back from the dead and resists an evil empire who's been persecuting your people. And this is told in loads of different forms. And then eventually it gets picked up by the Romans and turned into Christianity, as we know it, the Christian mythos. But it only becomes something that we can recognize historically once it's used for some purpose of power. And I think you see this happening with science fiction as well. You had these kind of evolving science fiction narratives which come out of pulp storytelling, and then they move into video games, and they're always shifting and turning. And then Elon Musk, who I'm told, I've only been given this fact today, so I'm going to repeat it without having double checked it, but that he's actually named after a character in a pulp science fiction novel.
True.
Yeah. Okay. So I just discovered that today to add to my little hoard of information about him. And he's clearly got a passionate interest in science fiction. I don't know how much he actually kind of reads in depth, but he picks up these narratives and he uses them over and over again. Neuralink, linking into the Matrix, basically jacking in that cyberpunk idea. And of course, SpaceX, finally building that rocket to Mars. Really, I would argue SpaceX it's a military contractor, but Elon is a brilliant marketer. So he takes that sci-fi mythos and he builds a completely different profile for his company. He's not talking about the military uses or his contracts that he's going after. He's saving humanity by taking us to Mars, which I think is probably bullshit, but people are hugely enthusiastic about it because it's based on the whole space race, the era of Star Trek. People grew up with this. People really thought it was going to happen. And then there's this huge disappointment that someone like Elon is able to pick up, or someone like Peter Thiel I don't know why Peter Thiel has named his company after this magical item, which makes him sound incredibly evil that he's done it. It's like he's trying to tell us something.
Yeah, so it almost sounds like when powerful people engage in science fiction, you just call it politics or religion. And some of the sort of most recent, I'm thinking of some of the most recent examples of this, so sort of somewhat admirable and at least optimistic recent example of this is Dario Amado's essay, Machines of Loving Grace, where he kind of paints this picture, almost Cartesian picture of a database full of Nobel Prize winners, fast forwarding medical revolutions, etc. It's quite moving. And then on the other side of it is, Alex Karp's, the chief of Planeteer's new book, The Technological Republic, which is a sort of dark militarized exploitation of AI. I mean, I would say, at least in my book, Jay and I have been talking about this, both of those are science fiction in some basic sense, but they're also science fiction as politics. Is that the kind of point that you were making earlier?
Yeah, well, I mean, touching back on Nick Land, who I just happen to be researching at the moment. So most of his essays really are written as theory fiction. And that was, he didn't develop that practice. That was from another academic in the CCRU, Cybernetic Research Unit. And of course, with science fiction and its extrapolation of ideas, it's often called a literature of ideas. It's always sitting very closely to theory over there, especially social theory. So someone like Ursula Le Guin, both of her parents were anthropologists. So she grew up from a very young age with social theory and that kind of thinking. And then clearly that deeply informs her fiction writing as well. And I don't have a clear line for what the benefit of the fiction is, other than beyond the realms of physics, of course. Most sciences are working in a much lower tolerances. We can't really predict stuff. We can't do Isaac Asimov's psychohistory and even determine what tens of billions of humans are going to do. So I think there's something about placing theory into fiction, which is kind of a way of testing it against human experience. What does this theory actually do in the realms of the human psyche, which story kind of models?
As someone who teaches folks how to write and creative fiction and science fiction, One of the things that I've tried to convey to my content creator friends in science fiction in the past is that I just see it as such a narrative failure to say, oh, if we had artificial arms, they would go crazy. They would kill the kind of Black Mirror techno thing of the week. It goes bad and therefore everything's terrible. And the other less sophisticated versions of that. In other words, the narrative constraints of science fiction, I think, often push us towards certain kinds of negative depictions of future technology, as opposed to a more techno-realist view that says, if we had a future with X, Y, and Z technologies, there would be good uses and bad uses, and people would still have unrequited love, and et cetera, et cetera. And those are much more rare. Do you counsel people to kind of avoid those techno sand traps in their writing?
Yeah, it's difficult because there's a lot of kind of constituencies attracted to science fiction who now have some ownership of it. So there are definitely people who sit down and have done so successfully and extrapolate technology in science fiction. But I feel the long history of science fiction, that is kind of an outlier in terms of what science fiction does, that these things are really always symbolic, metaphorical, whichever kind of framework you want to put around them, that kind, poetic. And especially if that science fiction is going to touch into the realm of myth, like Frankenstein is kind of nowadays often cited as the first science fiction novel, largely because it's one of the first to really be an effective work of fiction as well. But it's very unclear what's actually happening in science fiction in Frankenstein with the raising of the monster itself. It could be a kind of semi-magical act. There is the presence of electricity.
It's not a cautionary tale about reanimation technology. It's something else.
No, it's like, don't bring back bodies from the dead because they will haunt you to the end of your life. That's not what Frankenstein is saying. And I'm not sure if you can there was this kind of bracket of science fiction writers, especially in the 70s and 80s, like Larry Niven and a bunch around there. Maybe Clark was one of the earlier ones, and a lot of these guys came from the John W. Campbell kind of golden age, astounding magazine tradition. But Campbell himself was a tremendously problematic figure in science fiction. And I feel that really that idea about science fiction kind of hijacked science fiction because American culture was so powerful at the time, and this idea of science fiction kind of took over the rest. And I think broadly in its kind of at least 200 or 300 year history, that extrapolation of technology is kind of a minor subsector of what science fiction does.
I noticed that Frankenstein was in your recommendations of 2025 books to read, science fiction books to read. But it is an interesting example, Frankenstein, of sort of science fiction as a classical mythos, and it takes up some of the classical themes of mythos, like irreverence and the kind of Promethean ambition, and in a way. So I think you're right. It's not about don't reanimate or animate or create life from dead matter. But it does seem to talk about, irreverence and this whole theme of like pursuing nature to her hiding places, and that seems like a sort of perennial kind of theme. So in that sense, if science fiction is mythos, it does what mythos does, sort of continually, almost obsessively revisits the things that we're most scared about.
Well, there's probably only a few really profound questions in human life that we're just going to keep coming back to over and over again because we still haven't got a suitable answer for them. One of the things that's interesting that you can chart from Frankenstein very clearly is what happens to the monster, that he lives for something like 100 years as a literary character, and it's basically a big bestseller when it's published. So it's one of the first blockbuster novels in a sense, and then at some point it gets picked up by Hollywood, and you have some serious adaptations. And then over the space of about 60 years, Hollywood turns Frankenstein into like Herman Munster, basically. Just a big monster with a bolt through his neck. And that's what Frankenstein is now. And actually, you see this kind of pattern of evolution of, you have some storyteller, I'm now struggling to think of another example, having said this, who is maybe a scientist, a philosopher, is kind of dealing with these deep questions, and they fashion a kind of myth, a sci-fi myth in answer to it. And then over the space of decades, this myth becomes more and more popular. The time machine, maybe H.G. Wells spends like 20 years from his first short story on the subject to writing the time machine itself, kind of conceptualizing time and a machine that can manipulate time. And then he has some political ideas in the story that he's writing. And then something like a century later, that's become the Avengers diving through quantum realities to save half of the population of the universe after the Thanos snap. So these ideas, once they come out of a mythic story, they do kind of echo, and they get simplified, but they broaden their reach in that process as well.
I'm sure you know that in the 1880s, the Looking Backward novel by Bellamy was hugely influential in the United States. There were hundreds of clubs that got set up and was a kind of proto-socialist movement in the United States. But since then, and the examples like that, we've had very few successful utopian science fiction narratives, and mostly dystopian ones like Brave New World in 1984 come to the fore. And right now, it feels like we're living through Transmetropolitan from Warren Ellis with the kind of the gonzo version of a cyberpunk future. Do you think that utopian fiction, or at least more optimistic fiction, like the solar punk fiction or some of these other varieties of more optimistic versions, do you think that they will have a comeback? Do they have a role? Your work on Ian Banks, I'm also a huge Ian Banks fan. I'm not sure that Ian Banks actually tells us much politically about what to do about the future, since it's like wait for the good AIs to take over and fix everything. But I'm looking for those utopians out there who are going to inspire us, like Cory Doctorow sometimes does.
Yeah, and it's something I'm exploring at the moment, is the relationship between science fiction and socialism. Science fiction in the broad sense, including a lot of fantasy as well. Because every stone I look under, there's another kind of proto-socialist utopia written in the late 19th or early 20th century in Russia or in Europe or in America. A very long history of feminist utopias that go all the way back substantially before Frankenstein, actually, kind of into the 1600s and the very beginning of publishing. So they're really bound up, because we can't really, we hit this point as a civilization where suddenly the future is there. I think it's all bound up with probably the collapse of the Christian mythos. So you're a European peasant, you think you live in a kind of clockwork universe, and then, 50, 100 years later, the equivalent of that same individual is now understanding that their universe is infinite and time goes backward and forwards forever. And why am I stuck here hoeing this field in that case? So the revolutionary impetus comes out with our changing ideas about reality. So then we have to start imagining what could a better future be like? First without feudalism, and then now capitalism is the target of a lot of science fiction. So you have things like the solar punk movement. I did a podcast essay on this a couple of years ago, and solar punk is still at the moment a genre without a story. There's no neuromancer, which in the way of cyberpunk or Blade Runner. There are some books like Always Coming Home by Ursula Le Guin, or a couple of Kim Stanley Robinson novels that you can retrofit into solarpunk. But it's largely, in fact, probably the single most significant work of solarpunk is an advertisement for yogurt, a yogurt brand, which envisions this kind of solar punk future. But it's because really we're just trying to answer the current contradictions of our economic and social systems. But I would expect some really significant works of solar punk to emerge. My critique of it was that, I mean, it's very reminiscent of Maoism on pretty much every level. If you go into like the solar punk video essay corner of YouTube, that is essentially the Maoist Marxist corner of YouTube.
You'd be so much happier if we sent you back to the fields.
Yeah, well, I mean, I absolutely wouldn't, because I don't have that skill set at all. But you guys go and do the farming.
Well, I'm sure we'd be first in line, actually, given what's happening right now.
Sure.
And Damien, if I could ask you, somebody who, spends a lot of time thinking about writing and teaching writing, we increasingly have a technology that is at least billing itself as a tool for writing. Large language models do a lot of writing already in the real world, and a lot of people use them to write. How have you been thinking about that and the sort of your intersection of thinking about technology and thinking about writing? Has it changed your practice?
Well, LLMs are fascinating. If we put aside the idea that they're AI, there's something of their own.
Right.
There's a very understandable backlash to them, which I think is fading because they're now just a part of the world. And if you happen to be in one of the kind of echo chambers that hates AI, LLMs rather, you're still going to be massively exposed to the output of them. And really, I think that creators who are intent on working professionally just instantly started picking up these tools to see what they could do and what can they add to the system. So can they replace people? Who knows? I think if they get to that point, then if they can replace a novelist, then I think we're kind of all bets off on everything anyway. Who knows what the consequences of that will be? I think they're probably going to tap out, I'll make a prediction, at allowing artists to conceive what they were unable to conceive before, to write combinations of words, sentences that are just on the edge of, let's say, comprehensibility, that are pushed into the area of poetry, but the LLM can just bring enough together that the reader will still derive perhaps something very powerful from that experience with the interaction with a real human writer as well, who can shape that product.
And does it matter, do you think, that it becomes fuzzier and fuzzier who the author of the work is under those circumstances?
Yeah. No, I don't think it matters. I think we're going to have to let go of the idea that we are the authors of these things, which was probably always a bit of a conceit to begin with, that we could get away with. But we've still got these. I mean, copyright has been profoundly outdated for a long time and a big problem. The internet is a machine that copies stuff. If you put it on the internet, it's been copied 10,000 times instantly. So none of this really works. Of course, people's anger about it is because many of us are deeply unfulfilled in our lives. We have a hope we might fulfill ourselves creatively in something, and now that hope seems to be being cut off. So the real question is a much bigger question of how we value people, and but the LLMs are just sparking yet another ledge of that step down of what is the valuing of humans if we're not really essential labor items.
Stephen Marsh, who's a novelist and also writes for The Atlantic, has done some really interesting work on this, has sort of written in a couple, I think, of AI-assisted novels, and his metaphor is that writing is increasingly going to become like hip-hop, where you really do have to kind of know the entire musical history extremely well to be able to produce a credible, attractive piece of hip-hop. And so there's a kind of blending of writing and DJing, if you will.
Well, it seems to every new technological development advantages somebody, and LLMs seem to advantage the art historian over the artist, because it's the person who understands what has been crushed into this fuzzy JPEG and how to bring it out again, that are actually best able to use the technology.
That's a beautiful way of saying it. I guess you do get different art though when it's produced by art historians than by artists.
Yeah, well, the art historian has the idea that you should, these categories of which I am one, the critic as well, the idea that you should have this knowledge has been largely dismissed because we have quite a populist, I guess, understanding of art and creativity. But actually, I think this is, like you say with hip hop there, I think this is across all these fields now, that probably the great science fiction storytellers of the next few decades are going to have a very strong critical knowledge of science fiction, so that they can use all of these tools to make something that is beyond the capacity of someone who's simply expressing their own, when I work as a writing teacher, although now I do that in a very diverse way, but when I was teaching adult learners, and you'd see very quickly that most people had the same idea. Well, you knew what their idea was going to be from who they were, because they've been very busy, they've been working. This is their first opportunity to express themselves creatively. So they're going to hit the thing that someone who's trained in this would have hit a decade earlier in their development. And that is, I guess, what LLMs will stress. It'll be very easy to kind of purge yourself of all of those things that are very standard, cliche, you might say. Does that make sense? Yeah.
This idea that LLMs are going to change, but also supercharge in some ways our creativity reminds me of two novels. One, Hesse's Glass Bead Game, where the protagonists are masters, have become scholars of many diverse fields of investigation, and are able to use symbols to represent complex arguments about the articulation of these different disciplines. And similarly, I don't know if you've ever read Fred Pohl's Brainwave. He wrote it in 1956, but just about everyone on the planet, including the animals, suddenly becoming a lot smarter. And he depicts the evolution of language, that we would only need like 1 out of every 10 words in our communication, because we've become smart enough that one word would, in the right context, the right intonation, would convey all this other meaning. And I have this sense that this is what we're talking about here, that the more adept, like when my wife does, who's a sculptor, when she does criticisms of her students' work, she asks the student, tell me how does this relate to the history of art? There have been other people who made these kind of birds or whatever you're making, and do you know about them, and what are you trying to say in relationship to them? Knowing all of that is a part of what we bring both as creators and as consumers of science fiction.
Well, Damien, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the Glass Bead Game opens with basically a long dismissal of the essay as a form. He's like making fun of all these random weird essays that gets published, which are like a combination of, and this is still the dominant form of the essay, 100 years later, examining Blade Runner through a Lacanian synthesis or something like that. And that's the thing that LLMs can do almost instantaneously. They can give you that essay. They can give you every possible combination of that. So the question becomes, what can't they do? What is the peak that they can't get to?
I wanted to, David, if you'll permit me to circle back a little bit to the beginning, where we talked about science fiction as a kind of early draft or potential future draft. And one pretty fascinating and pretty bizarre development of the last, I'd say, 3 years is the rise in sort of AI relationships. So grief bots, therapy bots, dating bots, friend bots, etc., everything from companies like Replica. And I guess, this has certainly been a topic of science fiction. I'm thinking, just off the top of my head of, Her as pretty prophetic here, Her, the movie. But, it's one of those areas where there's this really interesting combination that there's a certain technical ability that the LLMs that are at the heart of this are capable of. And then there's our perennial human tendency to project humanity onto inanimate objects, playing with each other. So appealing to you here as a
and
historian of science fiction. Well, what do you make of this stuff?
well, I would just add, and a legitimate moral concern that we want to make sure that we don't actually step on a conscious being when it actually comes about.
And we won't know. Ted Chiang again. So I think this is one of the greatest short science fiction novels ever written, The Life Cycle of Software Objects. I think it's still Ted's longest novel. And it's basically a pair of software developers who are building kind of like Tamagotchi type things, little AI constructs. And they never really know whether these things are sentient or have any actual self-consciousness, but they are able to behave in these increasingly complex ways. So this software developer is kind of dedicating themselves to shifting these constructs to each new software platform to keep them alive. And that I think is, I don't know if it's the central point of what AI potentially might do, but it's certainly there that we'll probably never know, and it will very quickly arrive in places. So I've used this example in a few talks of your toaster. The talking toaster is a nice science fiction trope. So your toaster talks with you. It's not very sophisticated. But you have a kind of couple of minutes with your toaster every morning for a few years. And then what happens when you want a new toaster? What's the emotional experience of getting rid of your talking toaster? And this is, I think, is going to be I think companies probably already are saying we don't want anything that appears human coming out of AI. We don't want people bonding to their smartphone at that level. And I think you can probably see this being kind of stripped out of things like Gemini. Like Google Gemini is very flat. It almost feels like you're not supposed to form any particular bond with it. Yeah.
15 years ago, you had stories coming out of Iraq of American soldiers putting the pieces of their blown up robot back together and saying, we want this one back. Don't give me a new one. Just give me this one.
Yeah,
and
sure.
That seemed cute at the time, but may not be cute in the future.
Yeah. I mean, I just think descriptively, this is a very concrete, even, almost primitive kind of point. But I think as this kind of stuff is going to increasingly happen, people are going to appeal to science fiction for moral guidance because they won't have anywhere else to go. So, as these relationships become more significant, just like if there ever is a meeting with intelligent extraterrestrial, people are going to appeal to science fiction because they're not going to have anything else to appeal to. That's an interesting, concrete sort of political function of a literary genre that almost doesn't exist in others.
Well, I guess we've done this quite a lot with the mythos over millennia of human development, that the people who had some kind of relationship to the mythos gain this very privileged status within a civilization. Who is it that can talk to God for you? It's your right. priest for most of their history of religion. And we don't have that transcendent realm. We have immanent realms now, and we've kind of replaced heaven with the future. So who can give you some grace from the future? Possibly a futurist. We've got quite a few like academic disciplines now, which I see as very much like children of science fiction. If you just take the fiction part off. So there's a big video essay I'm working on called Techno Bullshit, The Secret History of Science Fiction. And it's all the places where science fiction has been used as forms of techno bullshit, starting with L. Ron Hubbard. So Hubbard is one of the core golden age science fiction writers, very good friends with John W. Campbell. And without Campbell, he probably couldn't have got Scientology started. I'll try not to get you sued by the Scientologists here. Hubbard just, he's spent quite a lot of time studying self-help at that point, partially to deal with his own alcoholism and his many mental health problems. If you see him recordings of his public talks, he's very uncharismatic, but he's learnt a lot of tricks of public talking, the kind of things that Donald Trump does, actually. And then he fuses these all together with these ideas from science fiction. So you're not possessed by a demon, you are a phaeton trapped on Earth instead, and create something very powerful from there. One of the pioneers of techno bullshit. which has then, I think, proliferated into a number of different areas of our culture. Since sometimes with really good effects, but not in Scientology.
Speaking of our current political situation, there seems to be a return of a certain kind of reactionary futurism and reactionary science fiction imagination that we haven't seen in a long time, a kind of, neo-authoritarian. But, the reason I asked about Tolkien earlier is if you squint, there's a kind of neo-feudalism. Yanis Varoufakis talks about techno-feudalism as the form that's emerging now. Do you think that what Musk represents is a kind of merger of these reactionary narratives and political movements with a certain kind of futurism?
Yeah, it's very worrying, actually, what Musk represents. So I did a new video essay this week on the technogarchy. So these are the leading oligarchs of the technology industry, who are, if you look at the richest Russian oligarchs, they have maybe 8 billion. Putin, maybe quite a bit more. But these guys are up in the $500 billion of fortunes, heading towards $1 trillion. These incredible monopolies that Varoufakis calls, techno-feudalism, because we're now all paying rent to these guys, or even not paying rent. We farm their algorithms and we get a little bit, but they're getting most of it. I'm a techno serf because I'm a professional YouTuber, so I already live with these algorithms, but in a relatively privileged sense. Because the real future of those algorithms is platforms like Uber, but essentially for every industry. Really, what purpose is there in having a company when there is a platform and there are customers and you are whatever it is you do and you're just employed through that platform instead? So clearly there is some potential there for a profoundly feudalistic society merging into something like an Orwellian Big Brother state as well. And I guess what I wonder is how much these guys, because there seems to have been a shift in their characters, their views, sometime around Trump, I guess Trump's first election, it began. What are the private WhatsApp discussions? Are they all saying to each other, look, this is just where it's going to go. A few people are going to be the feudal lords. It may as well be us. And that's what they're playing for now. All inspired by sci-fi. They all have quite public sci-fi reading histories as well that they talk about, and largely misinterpret the books that they've read for their own advantage.
Yeah. They bought their bunkers in New Zealand. They're prepared for every contingency.
Yeah, I think maybe that was the last plan. I think
now it's to try to take over.
New plan. I think when people started joking that their bodyguards in New Zealand would just shoot them and eat them as soon as shit hit the fan, they thought, we need more control over the situation.
Good. Yeah, so I stopped stocking canned food. I realized that was probably not the route to go here. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Nir, do you have anything more?
No, really fascinating. Thank you so much, Damien.
Yeah, thank you for your time, and keep up the great work. Your commentary on SF is just so enlightening.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me, guys. Great to chat with you guys.
Thank you.